McKenzie, everywhere you look, men are struggling. As you know, the suicide rates are up, marriages are collapsing, and men are what you describe as angrier and lonelier than ever. From your perspective, what's really at the heart of this men's crisis in America right now?
It's a great question. It's kind of the $1 million question in the health and wellness space right now for men, right? Is what on earth is going on? And I really, I like to take a systematic and historical approach to this problem in understanding where we are now, because I think history is important. And what I have found is really this started not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, but it really started, following World War II, going into, the baby boomer era where we had a very clear, definitive line of success for men in our culture. It was clear as to what was considered success, what was considered uh, um, a good life for men, and then what was not. And uh, men subscribed to that belief. Men bought into that belief in some ways because we had to, but also in some ways because we welcomed it. What we're seeing now, and really starting in the 70s and 80s with some fundamental policy changes and with the great liberation of women into the workplace, which has done wonders to our economy, which has done wonders to our planet at large, um, it's really created a question that's needed to be answered, which is, okay, now that women are liberated into the world, what what's the role for men? And how can we define success for men clearly and obtainably and tangibly in a way that doesn't totally remove who we feel comfortable being and who we feel comfortable creating in ourselves? One of my favorite, as I was studying this men's issues topic when I first got into my journey, um, I stumbled upon a great quote from a study in the 90s that concluded that yes, women were opposed by their gender roles, but men have been constrained. Or let me restate that. There has been a saying that I've come across time and time again, and specifically from a study in the 90s that said that women have been opposed. Gosh, what's the right word?
Oppressed.
Oppressed. There it is. Women have been oppressed by their gender roles, but men have been constrained by theirs. And I believe both factors are true when we look at the history of why have men gotten to this point is really that second piece there is we've been constrained and we've welcomed that constraint. But we have to understand the effect of welcoming that constraint, especially in the 21st century, and the effect it can have on men who don't reach those constraints, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, man. And I agree, and I've done a large bit of studying this myself, and I look at it through a similar yet somewhat perhaps different lens due to the work. I think some of this has been intentional, and I'm not going to ask you the question here right now about your thoughts around that, but I would define myself as a traditionalist, maybe conservative to a certain degree, maybe liberal with some of my, not all of my social views, but definitely leans more towards a conservative, traditional worldview. So, meaning that I think it's going to have to perhaps swing, maybe not exactly back to where things were in the 50s, but if we're going to recalibrate this for men, there's got to be this fundamental foundation of that traditional masculinity role, that men knew what success was. Would you agree with that take? And let's unpack that a little bit, because you said men don't know the definition of success. So the first thing we can maybe do is give the guys here today a guiding aim to shoot at. So where do we start at defining success? Is it swinging back towards some of the things that were traditionally there for a man?
That's a great point. And I I love that you brought in the view of being more conservative versus being more liberal on this issue, right? Because I think it's important to understand. I think that 90-95% of the cultural construction that we have for men in our society is not only beneficial but vital in creating successful families, in creating a successful work environment, in creating a successful society. There are time and time again moments in which men are able to rise up and do the difficult, do the impossible, do the physically daunting tasks in our society, which pushes us forward. And so there is so many things that are wrapped up in traditional masculinity that we tend to overlook and only see the negative and the bad and the ways in which masculinity might seem out of date in today's standards, right? So when we talk about masculinity, when we have this conversation about whether to be conservative or more liberal on the topic, I often focus on what's good and what's bad. And to me, what's bad is the constraining feeling that comes with masculinity. But what's good is just how much has been constructed for us to fall into in order to find our purpose and direction in life. And that's the ultimate question, or the ultimate answer to this question, which is how can we use our masculinity to navigate to our purpose? How can we use our masculinity to central our focus towards finding a direction in our life that feels motivating, that feels encouraging, and that feels purpose driven? And so that is, in essence, the conversation when I talk to men in my coaching practice and in my groups about masculinity is, look, we can have the debate on whether to be conservative or liberal in this conversation or not, but let's look at what's really been great about this cultural construction and how can we maybe just make a couple adjustments to ensure that it lasts and it survives. Because what I don't want is people to say, oh, all of masculinity is bad, and therefore let's shy away completely from it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I didn't want it to enter into a conservative, liberal political discussion. I want to keep it more in the essence of masculinity and maybe the lack thereof that we're seeing in men. And I just use those words as frames. I think I would come from the view that all real masculinity is good. What we are sometimes labeling as toxic masculinity is actually absent of the real masculinity. You know, we had probably 2 years ago now, I had a conversation with Boldy Aldridge on the podcast. He works in the men's space as well, based out of Australia, really diving deep into the relationship between masculine and feminine, more of the roles that these people play in relationships, but then also societally as well. And he painted a beautiful picture of the synergy of real masculinity and real femininity. And I use it a lot in the coaching practice because a lot of the guys that we work with are struggling in their relationships because they're struggling with nice guy syndrome. They're living in guilt, shame. They're caught up in pornography, and they feel the disconnect in their relationships. And their partner begins to resent them and sometimes take on a more masculine role. You've probably seen this in men that you've worked there as well. If the man is absent of real masculine strength, the woman's is going to take that over. Like it's her nature. But a woman's nature also calls her to lean into her femininity, but she can only do that when a man is walking in his masculinity. And the picture that he painted is, if you think of a river flowing, it consists of two parts. There's the river bank, right? Which is the frame that guides the direction of the river. That's the masculine's role, is to set a frame. The water flowing is femininity. If you remove the frame, the river bank, water is just going to chaotically flow everywhere. And that's kind of what we're seeing in society today.
Yeah, I don't believe or subscribe to the term toxic masculinity. And you're right. It's a term that we use because people kind of understand what it means, but in some ways we don't understand what's truly going on there. And so I don't believe in that. I say that all toxic masculinity is just shame. It's shame. That's all it is. It's how we're navigating shame. And that's the conversation for men, not are you masculine or are you not? It's the conversation of how are you navigating the shame that has come from, number one, navigating in the constraints in which you feel like you struggle with or you struggle to subscribe to? How do you navigate the shame when you fall short of the cultural expectations that you feel like are coming to you? And as a result, we end up framing and formulating a sense of ego. And I define ego as just essentially a self view that's constructed from external circumstances and external forces, right? So your ego is being constructed out of trying to seek not only just approval, but seek followers in the direction you want to go in life. And so that ego is often there to protect that shame. And that's what, as a man going into men's work and doing coaching with men, that's what I'm looking at is, how is that ego constructed? And then can I break that apart and find the shame inside and rip that sucker right out, right? That's the principal work that I do that really brings into this larger discussion about, what are the challenges and issues with men who are masculine, and how can we help them optimize themselves to really feel like they can go out and find purpose and direction in their life, because we haven't even been able to successfully go through step one, which is navigate your shame and figure out the shame that comes with, and that comes out with porn and infidelity and lying and betrayal. And let's navigate that first, and then we can start talking about the good stuff. And so I'm really glad you brought that in there, because I agree. I don't subscribe to the term toxic masculinity. I just think it's shame.
No, I agree. How much of these issues that men are struggling with, lacking knowing their true identity, lack of an understanding of a frame of real masculinity, allowing their ego to control, is a byproduct of lacking real models of what masculinity is. I don't know how old you are. I'm 42, so I was born in '83, grew up in the '80s. There was the Schwarzeneggers, the Stallones, kind of on the big movie screen, Hulk Hogan, real American hero type of thing. But then, like, you make it into the '90s, and it's like society took and culture took somewhat of a pivot, right? What was then celebrated was hookup culture, hip hop music. The status of a man is based upon, the notches on his belt. And then there's another wave, kind of sitcom, bumbling idiot dad. You got the Homer Simpsons, you got the Al Bundys. It's like, so the models that we were kind of indoctrinatedly like being taught were either, if you're successful as a man, you're going to be hooking up, sleeping with a lot of women, and you're not going to be a traditional type of man. But if you try to be a father at home, you're going to take a back seat to a more dominant, masculine woman. And I think what we have today is a generation of men that were raised lacking. This is my belief, and I'm curious. I'm pointing at you to get your thoughts around this. We're lacking a real model of what a true masculine man is. And obviously that's where you and I have stepped up, and there's been this rise in the last half a decade of the need for the work that you and I do.
I think a lot of men, especially who are in their 20s and 30s, this is one of the biggest issues that we have in our time is who do we subscribe to? There's one end of the spectrum, and then there's the other. And they're two totally opposite directions in which you can take your manhood and your masculinity. One vilifies the other, and the other vilifies the other, right? They vilify each other. And I think that's created a society in which men fall into those extremes and fall into extreme outcomes as a result. When I talk about men being constrained, imagine realizing in your life that you have to pick one of two avenues. Do I vilify traditional men, or do I try to achieve the outcomes of a traditional man, right? Do I try to raise a family and be able to provide for my family, be able to have children, be able to have a wife, or do I need to see that as the enemy? And that's what I see in our culture today, especially with men in their 20s or 30s. I've noticed that there are guys who will completely flip flop on those given where they are in life. And so they don't feel centered. They don't feel like there's a home base in their life. And, and that's really creating a lot of issues. So you're speaking to an issue that honestly, that's something I don't have an answer to. How do we tell our media and tell our culture and tell our society to frame men in this lens, right? All I can do is prove to that culture and society that this is what's desirable and try to frame that for them. And that's the key. But man, when I have a guy come into a group or come into a call with me, um, I'm looking to see which one are they subscribed to, which one are they kind of running to, right? Are they going towards MGTOW, incel, red pill, black pill, or are they going into more of that? I need to vilify and demonize those people who are falling into that, and I need to demonize and vilify anything that's traditionally masculine as a result. And both come with totally different issues and challenges.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to be our job to tell the media that message is wrong. I think you can kind of see culture shifting in front of us, and the podcasting space and shows like Joe Rogan kind of leading the way, and linking back to the political side of the conversation. I think last year's election was a big proof of that, right? The one candidate that spent time on alternative media got way more viewership, and it ended up swinging an election. That's not my take. That's actual data. So I think that's playing itself out, that people are buying into, that the narrative that has been shoved down their throat through media has been a lie. And I'm just grateful to be able to play a part on the alternative side. And I think that's what we're doing here is giving alternative forms of entertainment that are more packaged with truth, that guys are looking for. There's a reason why podcast is growing the way that it is, because guys are seeking these type of conversations, not the message that they were given for decades. But link it back to, you talked about the man being told to be a provider. We've talked about this masculinity being labeled as toxic. These messages, right? Being masculine, toxic. Your job as a man to be a provider. I think that message sometimes gets misrepresented or misheard through the man, that his sole job is to provide a house for a family and then step back. And it leads him to being passive, avoiding conflict within the home, which would be a very big pathway into nice guy syndrome, right? His needs are not important. He's just there to provide for the family, and it doesn't matter what he feels, what he thinks. Why is that such a trap for a guy?
Because it's focused on the wrong thing. It's focused on the deliverables of something else, right? Um, we are a society that focuses on outcomes. Outcomes matter more to us than the process on getting those outcomes, right? And we have to understand some fundamentals on what it takes to get the outcome we want when it comes to being a traditional man, right? You want a great job? Well, guess what? They're not going to hire you if they think you are a shell of who you think you can be, right? They're going to hire someone who understands their value, who understands that they're important to the world, who understands that they mean something. Um, you want a nice traditional household with a wife who has the option to go to work or not, right? Because you've put your family into a financial position to do that. Well, guess what? You're not going to find yourself a wife in that regard if you don't see yourself as a high value man, if you don't prioritize taking care of yourself, if you don't show them the desirable man that they want, that they feel is important to them. There was a study done by Pew that found that most women overwhelmingly prioritize, is the man funny, nice, friendly, and kind, over are they able to be a financial provider, right? That tells me that culture still prioritizes the how, not necessarily the outcome. And that's really true in relationships, and that's really true in the workplace. So if you want those outcomes, if you want to be a provider, if you want to be able to get a good, successful job, if you want to be able to have kids, your why and your how is way more important than those outcomes first, right?
I'm so glad you went that route and angle, man. I think because you used language that is traditionally online in the social landscape of high value, with normally associated to status, income, six figures, six packs, 6 foot, all these different kind of things. And I see it, and I've even had conversations with friends and associates that subscribe to that message. And then I step out into the real world, and I mentioned offline, like I live in a suburb, like north of Tampa. Yeah, there's parts of Tampa, like very isolated areas in the city, that maybe that is the norm. But the average person, like that's not the world that they're living in. I look up and down my street and block, and I see these happy families. With none of that being in their life, but it's guys that are, like you said, humorous, that have these extra skills that they bring to the table. So I'm so glad you painted that narrative.
It's true. It's what women really want, right? When I look at someone who is struggling in a relationship, my specialty is specifically navigating like relationship conflict. That's where my bread and butter is in my work and my practice. And I see a typical nice guy or a MGTOW guy get a wife or get a partner, and their partner goes, "This was not the man I fell in love with. The man I fell in love with was showing me that he was a high value man, that he felt important, that he knew he had a mission, and he was determined to accomplish something in his life. That's the kind of man I wanted." And when we ended up starting to date and when we fell in love, and I all of a sudden saw a completely different man. And I saw a man that wasn't didn't have his things that he was navigating, but had like irreversible patterns of shame and toxic shame in them, in which they felt it was just too big to tackle in their relationship. So then they ended up separating. And um, and that's because the man is focused on outcomes. I need to appear this way. I can't actually try to live this way. I can't actually start to do the hard things in order to get into this, in order to attract the kind of relationship I want. And those hard things mean looking at your patterns when the door is closed and you're alone in the bedroom. It means looking at your patterns on what you're searching for online. It means looking at your patterns on what you're doing to get the job you want, not the job you have. What are you doing when no one's watching? And I will tell you in that moment whether you are attracting someone who you want in life or attracting the consistent challenges you've been getting in past relationships that haven't worked out. You haven't changed your how and your why. And that's the problem.
I think it's James Clear says, what you do when you're by yourself is really who you are. And I've heard that exact narrative described to me through years of coaching with men. And my experience takes it back to this guy been struggling with a porn addiction for a decade plus. He was able to keep it in the closet while the courting was taking place, while the initial dating was taking place. This was my experience as well. Like I lived this out. I had a woman, I dated her for 4 years. 3 of those years she lived with me. By the end of it, we were tearing each other's heads apart. Like it was so brutally toxic. All fault on me, right? 100% onus was on me. And as we were separating at the end of it, and we're breaking a lease and we're splitting our stuff up, I asked her, I said, like, Stephanie, what do you think happened here? She's like, Frank, the minute I moved into your house, you became a different person. And for me, what I felt is at that point, there was somebody intruding on this secret space that I held. Like I could keep you away. This was my spot when I was alone, that I could go do my things. But when you're right next to me, when you're in the other room, now it's an intrusion upon my space. I'd lived that exact scenario 6 years ago, which was a big reason once I got free and everything began to change for me, I've dedicated my life to helping other men. So the guy that's caught up in that exact scenario right now, you mentioned this is a lot of what you do in the relationship space and coaching with men. I realized I had attracted the wrong woman. Like she was attracted to the character that I was playing versus who I really was. I was okay. I had to accept that, even though I thought she was beautiful and I had at some point thought of a life together. Like I had to cut that limb off. Like it had to go. Is that going to be the case for most men, or in a scenario like where you've played a character, attracted a woman, now there's some tension? Like, is that ever salvageable? What's the frame here for a guy to walk through?
It is salvageable. Now, in some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. It solely depends in that camp and in that situation. It solely depends on the woman you've attracted, um, as to whether they end up staying or not. And that requires just a leap of faith that no matter what, um, that this is the right thing to do. That making this change and being more honest and transparent with yourself is going to help you whether this woman is in your life or not. And it brings up another point, like why is it that the stakes are that high with men in their relationship, right? They don't want to change because if they change and they're honest with themselves, they may realize that their partner might fall out of love with them, or their partner might be like, this is not what I've subscribed to, I'm out of here, right? Why is that such a big deal for men? I have found it to be one simple reason, is because that woman is the only emotional output they have in their life. And so when they lose her, they lose everything. And they will use that woman to be their emotional output and their emotional outlet just to maintain the masculine image to their friends and to their family, right? So behind closed doors, this woman goes, oh my God, this guy is navigating a whole bunch, and I'm feeling like it's all coming down on me. I have to be the one who helps him navigate all of this. That is not what she subscribed to. She wants a man who can take ownership of his problems and navigate them. And that requires diversifying your network and opening the door to connecting with other men who have gone through similar challenges so that they can actually help you navigate them more effectively than your partner. And that's tough to hear and that's tough to understand. But I have never met a woman who said, no, I still want to take all of your problems, right? No, in many cases, they're like, I don't know why I'm taking all of your problems. Why aren't you going to other people? And so they suggest therapy and they suggest counseling. And there's a whole bunch of other reasons why that sometimes doesn't work out for men and nice guys particularly. Um, but we have to understand why those stakes are high. And you have to ask yourself in that moment, if you're finding yourself in this situation where it's like, you know what, it's time to be honest. It's time to look at my addictions. It's time to look at my patterns. One of the things we have to ask ourselves is, am I holding on to this woman because she's the only emotional output I have?
How much of this is rooted in lack of true self confidence? And if it is, what is the pathway to building the self confidence? Right? You know, I've sat here and I've interviewed a lot of very successful people, and it seems to me the people that succeed most in life understand their shortcomings and are not afraid to talk about it. Right? I think sometimes there's a strength that's built up in the confidence to go to another brother and say, "Hey, I'm struggling with this thing." Right? That takes real courage and confidence in self. But the guy that is unable, struggling with self-confidence, the guy that is holding on to the relationship because he doesn't see the confidence in himself, if this one ends, I can go and get another one. A very similar question that I asked Tom when he was on last week, right? So how can a guy begin to identify, like, is he just struggling in his own identity, and what's the formula in maybe building some of his confidence back up?
You have to look at what does it take to be truthful to yourself and honest with yourself. And I find that if you're operating with a deep-rooted shame at the center of your life, it is impossible to be truthful and honest with yourself. Shame is the worst emotion someone can feel in life. If you read David R. Hawkins' work he's a famous psychologist. His books are brilliant. I highly recommend anyone to read any of David R. Hawkins' work. He'll describe shame being the lowest thing, the closest thing we feel to death. It is awful. And what's even worse is having that be the center of your life. And until we navigate and understand what that shame is, and we come alongside it and we work with it, right? It's not just about avoiding it, we're working with it. And we get comfortable with it. We get comfortable being down there with that shame. Then we can start talking about making changes. Then we can start talking about looking at your patterns. Then we can look at your habits. Then we can look at your day-to-day practice. But you can't do that without looking at your shame. And Dr. Robert Glover talks about this in his book, No More Mr. Nice Guy, right? The elements of toxic shame. And I know that you're talking to him soon, so that'll be great. But that is the essence and the core of all of this. Is if you can understand and navigate your shame, you're going to find yourself far more honest and transparent with who you are. And once you are honest and transparent with yourself, you're able to have a lot more out in the open with people. I often think that one of the issues that men do is they show a version of themselves that's impenetrable, that's immune to pain and challenges. And the reason they're doing that is because they're trying to protect something. They're trying to protect that root flaw in their life. And the men you see who are just confident in social spaces and who just attract people in their social spaces, they're not showing a version of themselves that's impenetrable. They're showing a version of themselves that's human. And they're acknowledging their flaws and they're acknowledging their shortcomings, and they have them out in the open. They're not trying to avoid them. And to me, it's an essence of how we navigate our problems. Are you trying to avoid your shame, or are you going to work to replace it with something you care about more? And to me, generosity and some of these values, generosity, courage, compassion, these matter more to me than my shame. And so that's what my focus will be on. Life isn't about avoiding the problems you have. It's about replacing those problems with things you value more. And until you start approaching your problems in that way, you are always inevitably going to be the thing you are avoiding.
And that takes real courage, the ability to show yourself as a human, to show your flaws, to show your weaknesses, same time of your strengths. And I think the book you're pointing at from Hawkins is Power versus Force. Did a deep study of it earlier this year. We discuss a lot inside of our communities, right? And once you move into that state of courage, it's like now you're shifting into a very different realm of consciousness. It's the lowest tier in that, of power. So, guys, Power versus Force, David Hawkins, definitely check it out. Cause it paints all this. If you can grasp what it is a difficult book. So be prepared. But if you spend the time in understanding it, you really see a framework of how these things aren't just emotions, but they become states that we operate in. And I think there's a lot that a man can, because now it puts it into your control, right? I can build courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to move despite the fear. So incredible breakdown there. Trauma. Let's talk about trauma and kind of how it's unresolved wounds and trauma is leading to some of these things. I think you've been open about your past wounds and even failed relationships. And, McKenzie studies will point to unresolved trauma, being at the root of many addictions, compulsive behaviors, broken relationships, right? If a man is suppressing these things due to guilt, shame. So a lot of it is rooted in inability to look at the past and really unpack these things. How have your wounds, your past, your ability to process some of these things that you've had to go through assisted you in leading you into becoming the man that you are today, and also guided you in helping others?
Yeah, I mean, in essence, I found that it wasn't until I realized that my trauma, or the traumas that I've experienced in life, um, are teachable lessons, but they're not teachable lessons on how to avoid further trauma. and they become problems when they are, right? When they reveal, oh, it means I need to avoid this, I need to navigate around this going forward so that it doesn't happen again, you're not learning from that trauma. You learn from that trauma by actually acknowledging it, by realizing it's true, and then from there, by saying, okay, where is my opportunity to step into a certain value in which I make sure that this trauma stops with me? I realized as a man, the moment that I changed really as a man, and the moment I see that changes in hundreds of men that I've worked with in the past, is the moment that they realize that their problems are opportunities to stop generational curses, to stop generational problems, to stop cultural problems from continuing. You have an opportunity, Frank, just in your life, looking at your problems to say, oh, this could stop with me. I just need to find a way to make sure it stops with me, right? So what am I going to replace this trauma with in my life to make sure that the next generation of children, the next generation of boys, the next generation of men see you in the lens of being compassionate and kind and look up to that, rather than seeing you as an angry, aggressive man and they look up to that, right? That to me is the greatest opportunity in our trauma, is to understand that that can stop with you.
Is that a too big of a message responsibility for a guy, specifically in this conversation that we've been talking about, living in shame, struggling in communications, struggling with nice guy syndrome? He doesn't even feel capable to manage the life that's in front of him, to think about a life after his that he's responsible for. Can feel like a lot of weight, right? So how can a guy see himself taking on that much of a responsibility?
I think part of it is to realize that our fathers, their fathers, and their fathers were no smarter than you. Um, they weren't more capable than you. They weren't more successful than you at navigating this. And that anyone who's gone through this, I'm sure you felt that at one point in your experience, and I know sure as hell I did. But to realize that the world of manhood and masculinity has been built and been embraced by people who have not experienced anything beyond what you've experienced is crucial. The first thing that I hear from men when they first come into group after a few weeks often is, I never realized that other men were struggling with the same thing. And until we recognize and realize that that there are millions of men out there who feel the exact same way about porn, who feel the exact same way about their relationship, who feel the exact same way about their wandering eye, who feel the exact same way about alcohol. Like, all of those things have been shared experiences that just haven't been talked about. It's like a book club that never gets together to connect on a book, right? They're all reading the same thing. They all know what happens in the story. They've all experienced that, but they've never touched base to find the interconnected pieces to understand the deeper meaning of the book, because they haven't had that collaboration. And so until you have that collaboration, until you meet with them, you're never going to really understand the context of, or the severity of your situation, without that collaboration with other men just like you. And once people realize, and once especially men realize, like, oh my gosh, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of men who have experienced the exact same thing I've experienced, will they ever believe that they can actually solve the problems they have? And that's the key, is you have to connect with other men to truly understand that your problems are not foreign. No matter what's happened in your life, they've resulted in some of a very, there are constants in everyone's stories that we can talk about, and we can learn from. And that's how you grow beyond.
And that's why it's important what you guys are building and creating with groups for men. And we have the Rebuilt Man, and we're honed in and focused, and we've gotten really clear on our guy, right? I'm not everybody's cup of tea, and I understand that. And I thought at one point it was my job and responsibility. And Frank 3 years ago wouldn't have McKenzie on, right? You got a group, I got a group. I can't talk to you. It's like. And then I had this like knock upside the head one day. It's like, Frank, there's 8 billion people in the world. There's hundreds of millions of men that are struggling. Like, you can't fix and solve all of them. In fact, like, most people don't really resonate with the things that you say. You're a former bodybuilder. Like, you're loud. You call people to a higher standard. I think all men should be called to a higher standard, but the language and the energy that I describe is very different than yours. And I have other friends that work in exactly the same space that are softer, more gentle, and I love them. And I'm like, I'm grateful that you have that, because your guy is going to hear me and he's going to be turned away. Maybe he had a dad with a mustache, and when he looks at me, he goes back to that. So he needs somebody that's got no facial hair. But it's so important. And for the guys out there, it's like, where do I go? There's a lot of different groups. Jump in a bunch of different ones. But you got to have that courage to go out there and be willing to have these conversations. And I'm was leading back to like this pendulum swinging that I described at the beginning. Like, I've seen it shift in 6 years of this work. I think this conversation 6 years ago was taboo. It wasn't being had, and now guys are waking up. Society's waking up, and there's a different message, I think, being delivered to men. And I'm grateful to be a part of it to whatever extent I am.
Yeah, it is too big for one person to navigate, right? And I see a lot of opportunity where counseling and therapy and those traditional mental health avenues stop, is kind of where men who are just like you and I can kind of pick up and continue. Because until you implement collaboration and conversation with other men into your daily life, you're going to find yourself on a steeper uphill than other men beside you, and that doesn't have to be the case. And we always tell guys in our groups to diversify your network, diversify your network, diversify your network. And the reason why is you don't get tripped up if a friend fails. You don't get tripped up if a relationship fails. You're able to continue on because that friend might have met your need in one aspect of your life, but it doesn't totally disrupt your whole life, right? And I found that to be so true. I have friends who I talk to about finances. I have friends who I talk to about relationships. I have friends who I've talked to about work and about personal struggles. And if any of those friends were to ever go away, yes, I'll miss them, but it won't stop me from my growth and my progress. And I find that to be true for any man, which is like, Frank, like, your style is is unique and has a certain approach, and that works for one avenue of men's life, and they'll bring one aspect of their life into your group, and then they'll come to my group and have a different aspect of their life addressed. And that's what I found with our platform that we've worked on building, is how can we help diversify that network for men. And I encourage any men's improvement company to kind of see that as the universal approach. We can't be all size fits all, right? We have to approach different avenues of men's lives and give them resources like that, because there's so few out there right now.
Yeah. And we've identified that in our organization as well, and diversified it through the coaching team and the experts and, guest trainers we bring in to talk. Cause yeah, it can't always just be me. So let's kind of dive into, the marketplace, what you're seeing kind of in the groups, the community, the specific coaching calls. You mentioned, your not your primary focus, but a lot of where you're focused in on is relationship resolving issues and dealing with guys that are kind of stuck there. I'm sure you had some ideas of what the conversation was going to be when you started this work. We've stressed a lot of them here today. what's been the reoccurring conversation that you've been having, whether it's been recently or just once you started in this work that was like, I had no clue that this was going to lead me to these type of discussions?
Yeah, I never thought that I would be focusing on relationships in my work, but I would say 85% of my conversations in groups and in coaching is around a romantic relationship and and a wife, a girlfriend, an ex-wife, something along those lines. And it really revealed to me in this industry that um, especially in men's work, that most men start seeking help when their partner has given up. And that I there have been so many cases where I'll end a discovery call and it's not irreversible, but it's a much steeper climb to get to where we need to go because they're 6 months late to contacting me. They're 12 months late to contacting me or to getting help in these avenues. And as a result, their partner's already moved out. Their partner said they want a divorce, whatever it is. That's when they reach out, is when they feel like all hope is lost. And that's a really bad habit that we have as men that we need to nip in the bud. And something that once they learn that lesson the hard way in our groups, they'll come with less severe stuff because they're trying to beat that worst outcome. They're trying to be more preventative and more proactive rather than reactive on some of the challenges they experience in life. But it takes getting them in and going through something really hard before they can actually realize that that is a good way to navigate our problems and our challenges. And so that's the number one thing that's really surprised me about this work as I've moved into it. I used to be in marketing. I had a marketing agency and all that, and I transitioned into this men's work once I went through my journey. It's been the number one thing that surprised me is just men will contact out of an act of true desperation, not as a, hey, this is starting to happen in my relationship and I need to work.
Yeah, I've seen the same case. And I had somebody ask me, it's been a couple of years now. I was on a live stream podcast and I flew up to Atlanta to do this. And we were having a deep discussion around kind of crisis rock bottom moments. And, whether it's getting caught with, your pants around your ankles watching porn, or you've acted out and cheated, or, I've seen so many of our men have come in and they're sleeping on the couch, sleeping at the neighbor's house, or sleeping in an Airbnb. And it's like, we've been able to salvage some of those. And those are some of our best stories. But maybe there's a guy, McKenzie, that's like here in this conversation. He's been leaning in every single second here today. And maybe he's 3-6 months away from that crisis, but maybe he's kind of blind to it, right? What are the signals within the relationship that a guy should begin to look for or perhaps see 3 to 6 months out so he doesn't reach that breaking point where it is too far?
Oh, that's a great question. That is a great question. And I've been asked that several times with men who are like, how do I prevent this? I always tell them, if you feel like you have a defense for everything, that's a problem. That's a problem. If you feel like you know how to spin something to favor you in any sort of flaw or challenge in your life, that's a problem. You aren't being honest with yourself. That's a sign that ego has taken over, right? If you can't recognize how you might have screwed up or messed up in a situation, it's time to start seeking help. And that's the hard thing to do because you're doing the opposite of what your ego is telling you to do, right? But that is to me the moment you find help is when you sit there and go, yeah, I cheated, but yeah, I got caught watching porn, but that's the moment that I say you need. It's time for coaching.
What goes back to that quote from Clear that I shared earlier: what you do by yourself is really who you are. Gentlemen, difficult question to ask yourself right now, right? Is there something that you're engaging in behind closed doors that if your wife found out, she would be upset about, or you would be ashamed about, or you would try to cover up? There's, it was the blue collar comedy tour. There's your sign, right? If there's something that you're engaging in that you're hiding from your wife, there's your sign that you're on the brink eventually of things collapsing. Because when you're sharing a life with somebody, you can only wear a mask for so long until she's going to walk in one day and the mask is going to be on the dresser and your pants are going to be down at your ankles.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's so true. And I don't I don't know why we've started to get into the habit of doing this um, in the past few decades, but men just trap themselves into a corner. And the ones who come and end up seeking help are the ones who have finally gotten to that corner and have been hounded on the head enough until they go, yeah, you know what? Maybe, yes, I have a problem. I have a problem and I need to get help. But it takes just people just beating them up for them to get to that point. And that's just disgusting.
Are you a man of faith? Yeah. You know, it's been interesting for me, this journey I've been on for 6 years, birthed out of truly discovering my faith and surrendering my life and trying to follow God and truly surrender my life. And, studying God's word and getting into the Bible, is has been transformative for me. And you said there, it's like, why have we started to fall into this pattern just in the last couple of decades? But what's interesting, man, I've talked about this a lot with guys. If you go back to the story of Genesis 2, we're in the garden, right? We're walking with God. And it's that first sin, that first fall of man. We eat the fruit of the tree. And whether you want to believe this story to be actual what played out, or it's a metaphor for human nature, I'm not gonna go there, but I think there's lessons embedded in the story. So we're walking with God and then we fall, right? And the first act of man is to hide, right? We hide. It's purely our human nature. And I think freedom, in the way that I try to lead men to it, and I'm sure this is the same with you, is being able to transcend above your fleshly human nature and get back to that pureness and wholeness that we were divinely created in. So it's recognizing, hey, we're all going to try to hide things, and that's going to keep us in that lower tier. That's going to keep us in force. We need to transcend into power, courage, love, all these things. So I don't think that this is a new struggle of man. I think that this has been the struggle of man since the beginning of time. And the guys that truly walk in freedom and live a life of purpose are the ones that recognize, if I allow my fleshly nature to guide my actions, I'm going to continue to fall. What must I whether lean into to be able to transcend and just recognize, hey, this is a part of how we've been broken.
That's such a good point. I'm really glad you brought faith into this, because I think it's an important piece to look at just on a literal sense too. Let's not even talk about the spiritual. When we talk about things that have changed in the past 20 or 30 years, men aligning themselves with an institution, men aligning themselves with a greater structure of life has gone to the wayside quite a bit. Men are replacing, Bible study and church services with influencers online who are telling them about red pill, incel, MGTOW, all that stuff. And those are the institutions they're aligning with now too, right? So it is, what has changed so much is again, the lack of institutions in our world who are there to support men and help men. And to be honest with you, faith has always been there. And in men's lives who are listening to this too, faith has always been there. It's just a matter of, um, are you willing to go on your own journey? Not subscribe to yours, Frank, or subscribe to mine, but be able to like pick up a Bible or be able to like go to a church service and ask themselves, okay, am I paying attention to what's being said? Do I subscribe to that? Can I subscribe to that? Can I surrender to this? Is something that I encourage most men to do if they're open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And most of our audience will resonate with that. I know the guys out there, whether they're struggling in their walk or they're seeking. All guys are seeking something beyond themselves, and we want to try to point them in those directions. Last couple of questions here. We'll wrap it up, man. I've really enjoyed the conversation here. You mentioned, transitioning from the marketing into this men's coaching space. You've shared some of the things that you guys are doing. What does this work, maybe specifically taught you about yourself since diving into the men's coaching work? or how has it maybe forced you to continue to look in and continue to grow?
It's definitely recentered me into my faith quite a bit. Um, you know, guys, as I'm sure you've experienced, will come to you with some pretty heavy stuff. And at first, it was a struggle for me to not lead with empathy. Um, I want to assume their emotions. I want to be one with them in their emotions. And every once in a while, that's what a guy needs. But they aren't connecting with me for me to just say, man, I feel your pain, right? Um, what I've learned about myself in this is that, uh, and in this process now working with, gosh, thousands of men around the world, uh, is number one, that my problems are shared with all other men out there. Man, if I think if a guy is walking in faith, I still know his struggles because I've experienced those struggles, right? Um, Two, it's taught me that men are truly capable of great things. They just need a couple tools. They just need a couple of things to put them on the right track. And their resilience and their persistence and their hard work with just those few tools will get them to achieve some pretty remarkable things in life. And three, it's given me a sense of hope. It's hard to read statistics out there about the outcomes of not doing this work and what that leads into the world. So when it comes to, you don't have to look any further than school shootings, and you don't have to look any further than domestic violence as the perpetrators of those. And for you to feel that just hopelessness. But after doing this work, I've never felt more hopeful um, because as long as the guy doesn't break and instead they seek help, as long as guys look for something like this, um, these problems are solvable. And until we get no guys coming into group, then I have cause to lose hope. But man, I've gotten so much hope in my life in the past several years because I've seen men go from living in an apartment or living in their car because their partner doesn't let them through the door to having a fruitful, loving relationship and ending up having kids and living a very purpose-driven life. And it's solely because they just had a few tools and they were open to hearing it, and that's all it took. And uh, and I just look forward to continuing to do that for hundreds of other men going forward and helping impact the world in that way. So those are really the big three things I've taken from all of this.
I share that hope is as well because the experience has been the same, right? I thought getting in, I'm fixing the guy, I'm helping him quit porn. It's like, then I got to meet some of the spouses and I got to see the families and I got to hear the impact. And you've been fortunate to connect in person with a handful of guys and have dinner and meet their fiancés and witness weddings taking place and see families restoration. And then I think about the generational impact and then you see the impact that, just going back to recent events the last couple of weeks of one man that had on the world, unfortunately it took his life being taken from him, but hundreds of millions of people now are waking up, and it only takes one, and maybe he goes through Groups for Men or he goes through the Rebuilt Man and think about what he'll build and create. We've had guys launch off coaching groups or launch podcasts and are now sharing the message, and guys that are leading ministries and running local groups. So to think the continued butterfly effect of all the work that all of us collectively are doing. I have a great friend, Cynthia Sam, that said, change the man, change the world. And I fully subscribe to that, and we're all collectively doing it, man. So I appreciate you and Tom and the team over there, what you guys are doing at Groups for Men. We'll have all of the groups, the sites, your links as well, plug down there in the show notes, guys. I think Tom mentioned it's free for a week to jump in, and you can try out the different groups. So if you guys are hearing this after last week's conversation, same organization, big fan of what they're doing over there. So check out. If you didn't hear the conversation with Tom, we'll link that down there. There is below. But any final parting words? We'll wrap it up with one final question before we do that. Any final parting words for the guy out there that is tuning in here today?
Oh, I can't emphasize enough the importance of, if you're sitting there going, you know what, I need to make a change, I need to make a switch in my life, that switch requires you to replace the problem, not avoid it. And so it's not about navigating around your diagnosis. It's not about navigating around your addiction. It's about going through it and finding something you care about more in order to fix it. That is the essence of what I do. I feel like it's the essence of what you do too, which is, okay, you have a porn addiction. What do you care about more? Connection with your wife? Great. How can we do that? Right? How can we establish more connection? And we focus on replacing the problem. That is the essence of it. And that's what I encourage every man to do when they start this journey.
Yeah. Amen. McKenzie, we like to end all shows here with the same and final question. You may know what's coming up. I think you've listened to a couple of the episodes, but the title of our show is called The Superhuman Life. And, the story in Genesis has been kind of my own journey of trying to discover and unpack what that means to me over these last 6 years. But I love to always get the guest take. So as we wrap up today's conversation, McKenzie, how would you define living a superhuman life?
A superhuman life to me is defined by a general approach, or the things around you, the challenges, the hardships, the relationships, are they around you for you, or are they just happening to you? And a man who is living a superhuman life is a man who believes that life is happening for them, not to them. And the moment that you see your challenges and your hardships as these hard things that are terrible in your life and that are hindering you, life's happening to you. But the moments you see those challenges and those horrible hardships and those things that are going on, and you say, what can I learn from it? What is it trying to teach me? That's happening for you. And that's a superhuman.
And guys, that takes a subtle shift in how you view it and a simple question to ask yourself. So I love that. It's a great place to end here. Guys, McKenzie Beeby, check out Groups for Men. We'll have all the sites, links, jump in the group for free for a week and find the one that resonates best with you. We hope you got value out of this conversation. And as always, guys, if you are getting value and enjoying what we're bringing here, you can continue to support the show. We ask every week, ratings, reviews. It helps the algorithm. It gets us out there into the ether space. But more importantly, especially here with today, we talked a lot about struggles in men, the crisis, issues that guys are dealing with. Many of them may have resonated with you out there. But if there's a guy in your life that needs to hear this conversation, maybe you guys had some discussions, maybe he's hinted at some things that he's struggling with, do us a favor, but more importantly, do him the blessing by sharing this episode and conversation with that man. But McKenzie Beeby, Groups for Men, your host, Coach Frank. We love you guys. See you in the next one.